On the morning of January 5, 1943, the light cruiser USS Helena was operating off Guadalcanal when Japanese aircraft appeared overhead. An IGD-3A dive bomber, known to Allied pilots as a Naval, came screaming down toward the ship. The gunners at the 5-inch battery had seconds to respond. They opened fire. Within moments, the Japanese aircraft exploded in mid-air. The crew watched pieces of the bomber scatter across the Pacific sky. What happened in those few seconds should have been impossible. For nearly 3 years, anti-aircraft gunners had struggled against fast-moving aircraft. The math was brutal. A typical anti-aircraft shell had to be aimed where the plane would be, not where it was. Gunners had to predict the aircraft's speed, altitude, and direction, then set a timed fuse to detonate the shell at precisely the right moment. Get any calculation wrong by a fraction, and the shell would explode harmlessly, either before reaching the target or after passing it. Estimates of rounds needed to down a single aircraft ranged from several hundred to several thousand, depending on conditions. But the Helena's gunners had just destroyed a diving bomber with devastating efficiency. Something had changed, something the Japanese did not understand, and something that most people today have never heard about. The shells fired by the Helena contained a device that would remain one of the most closely guarded secrets of the entire war, classified at the same level as the atomic bomb and the D-Day invasion plans. It was called the proximity fuse, and it was an American invention that would save tens of thousands of Allied lives. Yet after the war, credit for this breakthrough would become tangled in a web of competing claims. British historians would note that British scientists had first conceived the idea. Soviet propaganda would minimize American technological contributions entirely, and the proximity fuse, along with countless other American innovations, would fade from public memory, overshadowed by narratives that gave credit elsewhere. This is the story of how American genius won World War II, and how that truth got buried. The problem with shooting down aircraft had plagued militaries since the First World War. When planes first appeared over battlefields, soldiers shot at them with rifles. It rarely worked. Anti-aircraft guns improved, but the fundamental challenge remained. Aircraft were fast, small, and unpredictable. Shells were slow by comparison and needed to explode close enough to cause damage. The existing solutions were crude. Contact fuses detonated only on direct impact. Given the vast volume of sky and the tiny target, direct hits were nearly miraculous. Timed fuses required gunners to predict exactly when the shell would be near the aircraft, then manually set the fuse before firing. In the chaos of combat, with planes diving and weaving, accurate timing was almost impossible. Before the proximity fuse, anti-aircraft batteries could expend thousands of shells without scoring a single hit. Ships burned through their ammunition supplies while enemy planes continued their attacks. The concept of a shell that could sense when it was near a target, one that would detonate automatically at the optimal moment, had occurred to engineers in several countries. The idea was simple. The execution was considered impossible. In Britain, a scientist named Alan Butemant sketched out the concept in 1939. He proposed a tiny radio transmitter and receiver built into the nose of a shell. The device would emit a signal and detect the reflection from a nearby aircraft. When the reflected signal reached a certain strength, indicating the shell was close to the target, it would trigger detonation. The concept was brilliant. The engineering was considered beyond the capability of any nation on Earth. Consider the challenges. The device had to fit inside the nose of an artillery shell, a space, about the size of a fist. It needed to contain a radio transmitter, a receiver, an amplifier, a power source, and a detonating mechanism. Every component had to survive being fired from a gun. A 5-inch naval shell experiences a setback force of 20,000 times the force of gravity at the moment of firing. It accelerates from 0 to 2,800 feet per second in the length of the gun barrel. Then it begins spinning at 25,000 revolutions per minute as it travels through the rifled barrel. The British experiments produced some promising results with rocket and bomb fuses, but they could not solve the artillery shell problem. They could not build vacuum tubes rugged enough to survive being fired from a gun. They could not miniaturize the components sufficiently. They did not have the industrial capacity to pursue the development while fighting for their national survival. In 1940, with German bombs falling on London, Prime Minister Winston Churchill made a fateful decision. Britain would share its most advanced military secrets with the United States, hoping to leverage American industrial might and scientific resources. The Tizard mission, named after British scientist Henry Tizard, carried a black metal box across the Atlantic containing the crown jewels of British military research. Inside that box were plans for jet engines, research into atomic weapons, and early work on radar and proximity fuses. American historians James Finney Baxter would later call it the most valuable cargo ever brought to our shores. And he was right, but not entirely for the reasons most people assume. The British brought ideas and initial concepts. What happened next was almost entirely American. In August 1940, a physicist named Merle Tuve received a phone call that would consume the next 5 years of his life. Tuve worked at the Department of Terrestrial Magnetism at the Carnegie Institution in Washington. He was an accomplished scientist who had pioneered the use of pulsed radio waves, work that contributed to the development of radar. The call came from Vannevar Bush, the MIT-trained engineer who headed the newly formed National Defense Research Committee. Bush had a problem. The military wanted a proximity fuse. The British had some theoretical work, but no working device. Could Tuve figure it out? Tuve said yes. What followed was one of the most remarkable scientific and industrial achievements of the war, an accomplishment that has been systematically forgotten or attributed to others for more than 8 decades. Tuve assembled a team at Carnegie. They called themselves Section T. Within weeks they had assessed the British work and concluded that while the concept was sound, the British approach would not work for artillery shells. The Americans would have to start from scratch. The first problem was the vacuum tubes. In 1940, all electronic devices used vacuum tubes, the bulbous glass components that preceded transistors. Standard vacuum tubes would shatter instantly when fired from a gun. The British had tried to develop ruggedized tubes but had failed. Tuve assigned the vacuum tube problem to a young physicist named James Van Allen. Yes, the same James Van Allen who would later discover the radiation belts surrounding Earth that bear his name. Van Allen worked with engineers at the Sylvania Corporation to develop something that had never existed, miniature vacuum tubes made with glass so thick and filaments so robust that they could survive the forces of being fired from a cannon. By early 1941, Van Allen and the Sylvania team had created the impossible. Tiny vacuum tubes that could withstand 20,000 times the force of gravity and keep functioning. Each tube was about the size of a pencil eraser, but that was only the beginning. The fuse needed a power source. Batteries of the era used liquid electrolytes that would be destroyed by the forces involved. Section T developed a new type of battery, one that remained inert until fired. The acceleration of the shell forced a glass ampule to break, releasing the electrolyte and activating the battery at the moment of firing. The battery had to provide stable power for the 15 to 30 seconds the shell would be in flight. The radio circuitry presented its own challenges. Lloyd Berkner, another member of Tuve's team, developed an improved design using separate tubes for transmission and reception. Harry Diamond and Wilbur Hinman at the National Bureau of Standards contributed critical improvements using the Doppler effect to detect approaching targets. By the summer of 1942, less than 2 years after the project began, Section T was ready for live fire testing. On August 12, 1942, the newly commissioned light cruiser USS Cleveland conducted a 2-day evaluation of the proximity fuse in the Chesapeake Bay. The targets were 3 radio-controlled drone aircraft. On the first day, gunners brought down all 3 drones with just 4 bursts of proximity fuse ammunition. The Navy cancelled the remaining tests. They had seen enough. Mass production began immediately. Consider what Tuve and his team accomplished. They had taken a concept that the British considered theoretically interesting but practically impossible. They had solved the vacuum tube problem, the battery problem, the circuitry problem, and the manufacturing problem. They had done it in less than 2 years, and they had created something that worked not just in laboratory conditions, but in the brutal environment of naval artillery. By war's end, American factories had produced more than 22 million proximity fuses. Over 100 companies participated in the manufacturing program. The cost exceeded $1 billion in 1940s currency, equivalent to roughly $15 billion today. The results in combat were immediate and devastating to America's enemies. In the Pacific, the proximity fuse transformed naval warfare. Before its introduction, kamikaze attacks and conventional airstrikes took a terrible toll on American ships. After the fuse became widespread, the kill rate of anti-aircraft fire improved by a factor of 3 to 10 times, depending on the engagement type. During the defense of the fleet at Okinawa in 1945, proximity-fused shells helped destroy hundreds of Japanese aircraft. Admiral William Halsey, who had worried for years about the vulnerability of his ships to air attack, watched the new ammunition revolutionize fleet defense. In Europe, the proximity fuse proved equally decisive. When the Germans launched their 5-1 buzz bomb campaign against London in 1944, British anti-aircraft batteries initially struggled to intercept the small, fast-flying weapons. Churchill personally intervened to authorize the use of American proximity fuses, which had been restricted to naval use out of fear the secret might fall into enemy hands. The results were dramatic. Before proximity fuses, British gunners destroyed only 24% of the 5-1s they engaged. After the American fuses were deployed, the kill rate rose to 79%. In the final week of the 5-1 campaign, anti-aircraft batteries were destroying over 90% of incoming missiles. General George Patton encountered the proximity fuse during the Battle of the Bulge. His artillery units used shells equipped with the American fuses against German troops caught in the open. The results shocked even Patton, a man not easily impressed. He wrote to the War Department describing the new shell with what he called the funny fuse. Patton reported that his forces had caught a German battalion trying to cross the Sauer River and killed 702 enemy soldiers with a single battalion concentration of artillery fire. The fuse enabled air-burst shells, which detonated at precisely the right height above ground troops, maximizing the lethal spread of shrapnel. German prisoners described the attacks as quick, powerful bursts for which there was simply no defense. Patton concluded his assessment with words that proved prophetic. "I think that when all armies get this shell, we will have to devise some new method of warfare, yet even as American soldiers and sailors were using this American invention to defeat America's enemies, the credit for its creation was being obscured." British accounts emphasized that British scientists had first conceived the proximity fuse concept. This was technically true but profoundly misleading. Many people conceive of inventions. The idea of a flying machine predated the Wright brothers by centuries. What matters is who actually makes the thing work. The British conceived the proximity fuse. The Americans invented it. The distinction is not merely academic. Conception requires imagination. Invention requires imagination plus engineering plus manufacturing plus testing plus production at scale. The British contributed imagination. The Americans did everything else. Merle Tuve himself acknowledged the sequence of events while making clear where the real achievement lay. In an interview after the war, he noted that Section T had received some rumors of circuits the British were using in rockets, and that the British eventually provided those circuits. But Tuve had already articulated how to put the concept into rockets, bombs, and shells. The circuitry, he explained, was rudimentary. The one outstanding characteristic in this situation, Tuve said, is the fact that success of this type of fuse is not dependent on a basic technical idea. All of the ideas are simple and well-known everywhere. What was not simple and well-known was how to make it work. That was the American contribution. The proximity fuse represents just one example of American innovations whose credit was diluted, shared, or simply taken by others. The pattern repeated itself across the technological landscape of World War II. Consider the atomic bomb. British scientists, particularly Otto Frisch and Rudolf Piles at the University of Birmingham, made crucial early calculations about the feasibility of atomic weapons. The Frisch-Piles Memorandum of March 1940 demonstrated that a bomb could be made with kilograms rather than tons of fissile material, moving the concept from fantasy to possibility. British researchers established the theoretical framework. They created the Maud Committee that confirmed an atomic bomb could be built in time to affect the war. They contributed scientists to the Manhattan Project. But the Manhattan Project was American. The $2 billion came from the United States. The facilities at Oak Ridge, Hanford, and Los Alamos were built by American industry and operated by American workers. The project employed over 125,000 people at its peak, the overwhelming majority of them American. The engineering that turned theory into working weapons was accomplished primarily by American scientists and engineers under American leadership. General Leslie Groves, who directed the Manhattan Project, later assessed the British contribution as helpful but not vital, yet he added a crucial qualifier. There probably would have been no atomic bomb to drop on Hiroshima without Britain's impetus, particularly Churchill's early support. The British provided urgency and initial concepts. The Americans provided everything required to actually build the weapons. After the war, some British accounts emphasized their foundational contributions in ways that obscured the American achievement. The atomic bomb became, in certain tellings, a joint Anglo-American project rather than an American project with British participation. The distinction matters because it shapes how we understand national capabilities and contributions. The pattern extended beyond weapons to logistics and industrial production, areas where American contributions were even more decisive and even more systematically minimized. When German forces invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, the Red Army faced destruction. Within months, the Germans had advanced hundreds of miles into Soviet territory, capturing millions of prisoners and destroying thousands of tanks and aircraft. Soviet industrial capacity in the western regions was either overrun or relocated beyond the Ural Mountains at enormous cost in production. The Soviet Union survived, and then it counterattacked. By 1945, the Red Army had pushed the Germans back through Eastern Europe and into Berlin itself. Soviet propaganda portrayed this as the Great Patriotic War, a victory achieved by Soviet courage and Soviet industry. The narrative became central to Soviet and later Russian national identity. What the propaganda concealed was the scale of American assistance. Under the Lend-Lease program, the United States shipped more than $11 billion worth of material to the Soviet Union. That figure equals roughly $150 billion in current value. The shipments included over 400,000 jeeps and trucks, 14,000 aircraft, 13,000 tanks, 2,000 locomotives, 11,000 rail cars, and millions of tons of food, petroleum products and raw materials. The raw numbers only begin to tell the story. The Soviet Union produced formidable weapons. The T-34 tank was arguably the best medium tank of the war. Soviet artillery was excellent. Soviet aircraft improved dramatically as the war progressed. But the Soviets struggled to produce the support equipment that makes modern armies function. American trucks gave the Red Army mobility it could not have achieved otherwise. By 1944, at the peak of Lend-Lease deliveries, 70% of Soviet military vehicles were American-made. The famous Studebaker trucks became so ubiquitous that Soviet soldiers made them the subject of fond reminiscence for decades after the war. More than 20,000 Katyusha rocket launchers, the devastating weapons the Germans called Stalin's organs, were mounted on the chassis of American trucks. American locomotives and rail cars kept Soviet railways functioning. The railways were the arteries of the Soviet war effort, moving troops and supplies across a country that spans 11 time zones. Almost half of all rails used by the Soviet Union during the war came through Lend-Lease. American aviation fuel proved critical. The United States provided fuel equivalent to 57% of Soviet domestic production. Much of this high-octane fuel was blended with lower-grade Soviet fuel to produce the aviation gasoline that modern military aircraft required. American raw materials filled gaps that Soviet industry could not address. The United States and Britain together provided 55% of all aluminum the Soviet Union used during the war. They provided over 80% of the copper. American explosives and gunpowder supplied more than 1/3 of Soviet consumption. The significance of this assistance was acknowledged by Soviet leaders during the war, when diplomatic courtesy required honesty. At the Tehran Conference in late November 1943, Stalin reportedly told Churchill and Roosevelt that the United States is a country of machines. Without the use of those machines through Lend-Lease, we would lose this war. After the war, Soviet propaganda changed the narrative. Nikolai Voznesensky, chairman of the Soviet State Planning Committee, claimed that Lend-Lease amounted to only 4% of Red Army material production. This statistic was repeated by Soviet officials throughout the Cold War. It was technically true and completely misleading. The 4% figure counted only finished weapons and equipment. It ignored raw materials, fuel, food, transportation, assets, and industrial machinery. It ignored the fact that American supplies arrived when the Soviet Union needed them most, during the desperate years of 1941 and 1942, when the outcome hung in the balance. Nikita Khrushchev, who led the Soviet Union from 1953 to 1964, was more honest in his memoirs. He acknowledged that Stalin himself had stated bluntly that if the United States had not helped us, we would not have won the war. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, the Soviet general who arguably contributed more than any other individual to the defeat of Nazi Germany, was recorded by Soviet security services making similar admissions in private. Now they say that the Allies never helped us, Zhukov said. But it cannot be denied that the Americans sent us materiel without which we could not have formed our reserves or continued the war. We did not have explosives, gunpowder. We did not have anything to charge our rifle cartridges with. The Americans really saved us with their gunpowder and explosives. And how much steel could we really have set up the production of our tanks without American steel? These private acknowledgements never became part of the official Soviet narrative. The Great Patriotic War remained, in Soviet and Russian historiography, a Soviet victory achieved through Soviet sacrifice and Soviet industrial might. The American contribution was dismissed, minimized, or simply ignored. The implications extended beyond historical accuracy. For decades after the war, Soviet propagandists pointed to the Eastern Front as proof that communism could defeat fascism without capitalist assistance. The narrative served ideological purposes that trumped historical truth. And even after the Cold War ended, the minimization of American contributions continued because it had become embedded in national identity. In the West, the pattern took different forms but achieved similar results. British contributions to the war. Effort were real and significant. Britain stood alone against Nazi Germany for more than a year after the fall of France. British intelligence, including the code breakers at Bletchley Park, provided crucial information throughout the conflict. British forces fought in North Africa, Italy, and northwestern Europe. British civilians endured the Blitz with remarkable courage. But British accounts of the war sometimes emphasized British contributions in ways that obscured American ones. The story of Enigma and the breaking of German codes focused almost exclusively on British achievements, on Alan Turing and Bletchley Park, the Polish mathematicians who first cracked Enigma and shared their work with Britain, received belated acknowledgement. The substantial American contribution to signals intelligence received less attention still. The proximity fuse story exemplified the pattern. British sources emphasized that British scientists conceived the idea. The American development, production, and deployment that actually won battles became a footnote to British theoretical work. The phenomenon extended to popular memory. British films and television programs about World War II proliferated in the decades after 1945. American productions did as well, but they often focused on specific battles or campaigns rather than the broader technological and industrial war. The image of plucky British resistance against Nazi tyranny became a dominant cultural narrative, one that was emotionally satisfying but historically incomplete. None of this diminishes genuine British contributions. Britain's early resistance prevented a German victory, Before American power could be mobilized, British intelligence provided information that saved countless lives. British forces fought bravely in every theatre, but the war was not won by courage alone. It was won by industrial capacity, technological innovation, and logistics on a scale that only one nation could provide. That nation was the United States. American factories produced 2/3 of all Allied military equipment used in the war. American shipyards launched ships faster than German submarines could sink them, ultimately producing over 50 million tons of merchant shipping. American aircraft plants turned out nearly 300,000 military aircraft. American arsenals manufactured 40 million small arms and 4 million tons of artillery shells. The scale was beyond anything in human history, and it was accomplished while simultaneously fighting a two-front war across 2 oceans, while supplying allies on every continent, while developing revolutionary new weapons from the atomic bomb to the proximity fuse. This was the arsenal of democracy that President Franklin Roosevelt described. It was the decisive factor in Allied victory, and somehow, in the decades after the war, it became the forgotten factor. Dr. Charles Drew never fired a weapon in World War II. He never commanded troops or designed bombs, but his contribution to Allied victory was as significant as any general's. Drew was an African-American surgeon and medical researcher who revolutionized blood banking. Working at Columbia University in the late 1930s, he developed techniques for separating plasma from whole blood and extending its storage life from days to months. His doctoral thesis, Banked Blood, a study in blood preservation, became the foundation of modern blood banking. In 1940, with Britain under German aerial bombardment, Drew was appointed medical director of the Blood for Britain project. He organized blood drives across the eastern United States, developed standardized procedures for collection and processing, and shipped more than 5,000 liters of plasma across the Atlantic to treat British civilians and soldiers. The following year, Drew became the first director of the American Red Cross Blood Bank. He developed mobile blood donation stations that became known as bloodmobiles. He created systems for drying and packaging plasma, and kits for reconstituting it in field conditions. These innovations made blood transfusion practical on the battlefield, saving tens of thousands of lives. Yet Drew is remembered today primarily through a myth, rather than his actual achievements. Many Americans know the story that Drew, an African-American, died because white hospitals refused to give him a blood transfusion after a car accident. The story is false. Drew died in 1950 from injuries sustained in a car crash in North Carolina. He was treated by white physicians at Alamance General Hospital, who attempted to save his life but could not overcome the severity of his injuries. The myth persists because it fits a narrative about American racism that, while addressing real injustices, obscures Drew's actual legacy. He was not a victim of the medical system he helped create. He was one of its greatest pioneers. His work saved the lives of Allied soldiers of every race and nationality. American plasma, collected and processed using Drew's techniques, reached wounded British soldiers during the Blitz, Soviet soldiers on the Eastern Front, and American soldiers across the Pacific and European theaters. This was American medical science, developed by an American researcher, saving lives around the world. It was one of countless contributions that somehow failed to register in the collective memory of Allied nations. The story of penicillin follows a remarkably similar pattern. Alexander Fleming, a Scottish bacteriologist working in London, discovered the antibacterial properties of penicillin mold in 1928. The discovery was genuinely groundbreaking, but Fleming could not figure out how to produce penicillin in quantities sufficient for medical use. For more than a decade, penicillin remained a laboratory curiosity. British scientists Howard Florey and Ernst Boris Chain made critical advances in purifying and concentrating penicillin in 1940 and 1941. They demonstrated that the drug could cure bacterial infections in mice and then in humans. But British industry, stretched to its limits by the demands of war, could not produce penicillin at scale. Florey traveled to the United States in 1941, carrying the precious penicillin mold. American pharmaceutical companies, working with government support, accomplished what British industry could not. They developed deep tank fermentation methods that increased penicillin production by orders of magnitude. By D-Day in June 1944, American factories were producing enough penicillin to treat all Allied casualties. By war's end, the United States was manufacturing over 650 billion units of penicillin per month. Fleming received the Nobel Prize for discovering penicillin, which was entirely appropriate. But the American industrial achievement that made penicillin a practical medicine, saving hundreds of thousands of lives during the war and millions since, received far less recognition. Once again, conception was credited to one nation while the difficult work of making something actually useful was accomplished by Americans. The story of American radar development follows a similar pattern of concealed achievement. Popular accounts of radar development focus heavily on British contributions. The Chain Home system that detected incoming German aircraft during the Battle of Britain receives deserved recognition. British scientists Robert Watson Watt and his team pioneered practical radar systems in the 1930s. The cavity magnetron, developed by John Randall and Henry Boot at the University of Birmingham in 1940, represented a genuine breakthrough in microwave technology. What followed that breakthrough, however, was almost entirely American. The cavity magnetron that the TISAD mission brought to America in September 1940 was impressive, but incomplete. It could generate powerful microwave signals. It could not, by itself, constitute a working radar system. The device needed receivers, displays, antenna systems, signal processing equipment, and integration into usable military hardware. American scientists and engineers at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology Radiation Laboratory took the British magnetron and built an entire family of radar systems around it. The RAD Lab, as it became known, eventually produced over 100 different radar systems during the war. Half of all radar sets deployed by the Allies were designed at the RAD Lab. The SCR-584 was perhaps the most important of these systems. This gunfire control radar enabled anti-aircraft batteries to track enemy aircraft automatically and accurately. It operated in the microwave S-band, using frequencies that German electronic countermeasures could not jam. When deployed at the Anzio beachhead in early 1944, it caught the Germans completely unprepared. They had developed jamming equipment for earlier Allied radars, but had nothing effective against the new microwave systems. The SCR-584 worked in conjunction with the proximity fuse to create an anti-aircraft system of devastating effectiveness. The radar tracked the target and calculated fire control solutions. The proximity fuse ensured that shells detonated at the optimal moment. Together, they transformed anti-aircraft defense from a matter of luck to a matter of engineering. American radar development extended far beyond the SCR-584. Airborne radar systems enabled night fighters to locate enemy aircraft in darkness. Bombing radar allowed heavy bombers to attack targets through overcast skies that would have grounded earlier missions. Naval radar systems detected surface ships and submarines, transforming the Battle of the Atlantic. The AN/APQ-7, nicknamed Eagle, provided bomber crews with map-like images of the ground below, enabling precision attacks on targets up to 170 miles ahead of the aircraft. About 1,600 Eagle sets were built and used primarily over Japan. The technology derived from the first microwave phased array antenna, invented by American physicist Luis Alvarez, who would later win the Nobel Prize for other work. American factories ultimately produced over 1 million cavity magnetrons during the war. They manufactured radar sets by the tens of thousands. They trained operators and technicians by the hundreds of thousands. The British invention became an American weapon system. Yet the historical narrative often stops at the TISAD mission. British generosity in sharing the magnetron receives emphasis. American development that made the magnetron militarily useful receives less attention. The implicit message is that Britain invented radar and America merely manufactured it. The truth is more complex and more favorable to American innovation. The contributions extended to the ground war in ways that rarely receive acknowledgement. When Allied forces landed in Normandy on June 6, 1944, they faced a daunting logistical challenge. The invasion had to succeed without a major port. The Germans held Cherbourg, the nearest suitable harbour, and they would not surrender it intact. Allied planners knew they would have to supply entire armies across open beaches until ports could be captured and restored to operation. The Red Ball Express was an American logistics system that kept Allied armies supplied during their rapid advance across France. Convoys of trucks ran around the clock on dedicated highways, moving fuel, ammunition, and supplies from Normandy to the front lines. At its peak, the Red Ball Express employed nearly 6,000 vehicles and delivered over 12,000 tons of supplies in a single day. The drivers were predominantly African-American soldiers, whose contributions to victory have themselves been underappreciated in historical memory. These were not glamorous achievements. They did not produce the dramatic footage that newsreels preferred. But they made victory possible. Armies that cannot be supplied cannot advance. The German counter-offensive in the Ardennes, the Battle of the Bulge, failed in large part because the Germans could not sustain their advance. They ran out of fuel while American supplies flowed continuously. The Liberty ship program demonstrated American industrial capacity at its most impressive. These cargo vessels were designed for rapid construction using assembly line techniques adapted from automobile manufacturing. The first Liberty ships took over 200 days to build. By 1943, average construction time had fallen to around 40 days. One ship, the SS Robert E. Peary, was assembled in just 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes as a wartime demonstration of American manufacturing prowess. While this was a publicity stunt rather than standard practice, it showed what American industry could achieve when pushed to its limits. American shipyards produced 2,710 Liberty ships during the war, along with hundreds of victory ships, landing craft, escort carriers, and warships of every type. This shipbuilding campaign replaced Allied merchant losses faster than German submarines could inflict them, breaking the back of the U-boat threat and ensuring that supplies continued to flow to every theatre. The statistics are staggering. American industry produced over 88,000 tanks, nearly 300,000 aircraft, over 2 million army trucks, and countless other military vehicles. It manufactured 47 billion rounds of small arms ammunition, over 41 million tons of artillery ammunition, and 12 million rifles and carbines. No other nation approached this output. Germany, with its vaunted industrial efficiency, produced about 47,000 tanks and 44,000 aircraft during the entire war. Japan produced about 3,000 tanks and 70,000 aircraft. The Soviet Union, despite heroic efforts to rebuild relocated factories, produced about 105,000 tanks and over 150,000 aircraft. American production exceeded all Axis powers combined in virtually every category of military equipment, and simultaneously, American factories continued to produce consumer goods that maintained civilian morale, while American farms produced food that fed not only the American population and military, but Allied nations around the world. This was not merely industrial capacity. It was industrial capacity combined with organizational genius, technological innovation, and a workforce motivated by genuine belief in the cause. The arsenal of democracy was real, and it was decisive. Yet somehow, in the decades after the war, this achievement became almost embarrassing to discuss. American industrial power was taken for granted rather than celebrated. The narrative shifted to emphasize the fighting qualities of various armies, the strategic decisions of commanders, the suffering of civilian populations. These were legitimate topics, but they obscured the fundamental reality that the war was won in the factories of Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Los Angeles, as surely as on the battlefields of Normandy and Stalingrad. The pattern of forgotten or misattributed American contributions raises difficult questions. How did this happen? Why did nations that owed their survival or liberation to American power come to minimize that power in their historical narratives? Part of the answer lies in the deliberate suppression of information during the war itself. The proximity fuse remained classified at the highest levels throughout the conflict. American military commanders worried that if the Germans or Japanese recovered an unexploded fuse, they might reverse engineer the technology. To maintain secrecy, the fuse was initially restricted to naval use over water, where unexploded rounds would sink beyond recovery. Its use over land in Europe was forbidden until the desperate circumstances of the Battle of the Bulge forced a change in policy. This secrecy meant that when the war ended, most Americans had never heard of the proximity fuse. There was no dramatic unveiling, no moment of public recognition. The scientists and engineers who created this wonder weapon returned to civilian life without acknowledgement. The factories that produced 22 million fuses converted to peacetime production without fanfare. Radar development was similarly shrouded in wartime secrecy. The radiation laboratory at MIT operated undercover, its true purpose known only to those with appropriate clearances. When the war ended, the Rad Lab closed, and its 4,000 staff members dispersed to universities and corporations across the country. The documentation of their achievements remained classified for years. By the time the secrets were declassified, public attention had moved on. The atomic bomb dominated discussions of wartime technology. The proximity fuse and advanced radar systems seemed like footnotes to nuclear weapons, despite their arguably greater impact on day-to-day combat operations. The Cold War introduced new complications. American officials became reluctant to emphasize wartime cooperation with the Soviet Union, cooperation that had included sharing technology and coordinating strategy. The Lend-Lease program, which represented American generosity at an unprecedented scale, became inconvenient to discuss because it highlighted assistance to a nation that was now the principal adversary. Soviet historians, meanwhile, had every incentive to minimize American contributions. The narrative of the Great Patriotic War served important ideological purposes. It demonstrated that socialism could defeat fascism. It justified the enormous sacrifices demanded of the Soviet population. It legitimized the Communist Party's rule. Acknowledging significant American assistance would undermine all of these purposes. British historiography faced its own pressures. The war years represented a high point of British national identity, a time when the nation had stood alone against tyranny. Emphasizing British contributions was natural and, within limits, entirely appropriate. But the emphasis sometimes came at the expense of accurate accounting of the Allied effort as a whole. The French experience was more complex still. France had fallen to Germany in 6 weeks in 1940. The Vichy government had collaborated with Nazi occupation. The Free French forces under Charles de Gaulle had fought bravely, but had depended entirely on Allied support. After the war, French national pride required a narrative that emphasized French resistance and French liberation. The dominant role of American and British forces in liberating France fit awkwardly with this narrative. None of these national perspectives was entirely wrong. British courage in 1940 was real. Soviet sacrifice was staggering. French resistance did exist and did matter. But, collectively, these narratives obscured the central role of American power in achieving victory. The academic study of World War II often reinforced these patterns. Military historians focused on campaigns and battles, on generalship and tactics. Social historians examined civilian experiences, resistance movements, and the home front. Economic historians studied mobilization and production. Each perspective illuminated important aspects of the war. None fully captured the decisive nature of American industrial and technological contributions. Popular culture shaped memory as much as academic history. British films about the war, from the Dam Busters to Dunkirk, celebrated British achievements. Soviet films glorified the Red Army. American films often took a more personal approach, following individual soldiers through their wartime experiences rather than celebrating national achievements. This cultural modesty had admirable qualities. It reflected democratic values that emphasized individual worth over collective glory. It avoided the triumphalism that had characterized earlier war narratives. But it also meant that Americans often learned more about the wars their grandfathers fought from foreign perspectives than from American ones. Merle Tuve died in 1982. He received the Presidential Medal for Merit for his work on the proximity fuse, but his name never achieved the recognition of other wartime scientists. The Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Laboratory that he founded continues to this day, but few Americans know its wartime origins or the man who built it. The proximity fuse itself remains largely unknown to the general public. Ask 100 Americans about the technologies that won World War II, and most will mention the atomic bomb. Some will mention radar. Virtually none will mention the proximity fuse, despite the fact that General George Marshall, Chief of Staff of the United States Army, called it one of the most important scientific developments of the war. The Red Army's Studebaker trucks returned to Russia and served in Soviet agriculture for decades after the war. Soviet veterans remembered them fondly. Soviet histories did not mention them. The blood plasma that saved lives on every front was collected, processed, and shipped using American techniques developed by an American scientist. The story became a myth about racial injustice rather than a celebration of American medical innovation. The Lend-Lease program provided material worth more than $690 billion in current terms to nations fighting the Axis powers. It was the largest foreign aid program in history until that point. It sustained British resistance, enabled Soviet offensives, and supplied forces across the globe. Most Americans today have never heard of it. These are not abstract historical questions. They shape how nations understand themselves and each other. They influence how Americans perceive their country's role in the world, and they have consequences for the challenges we face today. The United States did not win World War II alone. Britain's early resistance, Soviet sacrifice, Chinese endurance, and contributions from dozens of other nations all mattered. The war was won by an alliance. But it was an alliance made possible by American industrial power, sustained by American logistics, and armed with American technology. Without the United States, the Allies would have lost. Without Britain, the Soviets, or China, the United States would have faced a longer and costlier war, but it would have won nonetheless. That is not jingoism, it is arithmetic. American factories produced more than all the Axis powers combined. American technology, from the proximity fuse to the atomic bomb, gave Allied forces decisive advantages. American supplies kept Allied armies in the field and Allied populations fed. This story has been buried not through any conspiracy, but through the accumulated weight of competing narratives, each emphasizing different perspectives, none quite willing to acknowledge the full truth about American power. It is time to remember. The proximity fuse that destroyed that Japanese bomber over Guadalcanal was an American invention, developed by American scientists, manufactured by American workers, and deployed by American sailors. It saved American lives and Allied lives across every theater of the war. The plasma that kept wounded soldiers alive was collected and processed using American techniques. The trucks that gave the Red Army mobility were built in American factories. The aircraft that controlled the skies over Europe flew on American fuel and were often built with American aluminum. These were American achievements. They made victory possible. They have been forgotten or misattributed for too long. History matters because it shapes how we understand ourselves. Americans should know what their country accomplished. Not to boast, but to understand the capacity that exists when a free people mobilizes for a common purpose. We did this once. The proximity fuse, the logistics miracle, the arsenal of democracy. We did it not because we were perfect, but because we were capable, innovative, and determined. That is a heritage worth remembering. If you found this story compelling, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Each one matters. Each one deserves to be remembered. And we would love to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling us where you are watching from. Our community spans from Texas to Tasmania, from veterans to history enthusiasts. You are part of something special here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive.